to submit your question. If you don't want to ask your question live on screen, you can also submit it anonymously, and our tech team will be available to introduce it for you. We expect the Q&A portion of the event will start around 7:20. This event is being recorded and will be shared publicly at a later date. Closed captioning live transcript is available if you select it. During the presentation, we ask that you remain muted unless asked to unmute specifically. Also, keeping your view in speaker mode is probably best for Zoom and this experience. We encourage you to engage in discussion with the community in the chat during the event if you would like to. If you need technical assistance or have a question regarding the event, you can private message Assad, Megan, or Griffin, or submit it into the chat, and one of our wonderful staff will respond. So tonight, we're really proud to welcome Dedrick Asante-Muhammed, the Chief of Organizing Policy and Equity for the National Reinvestment Coalition. At NCRC, Dedrick has overseen fair housing, fair lending, the Women's Business Center of DC, the National Training Academy, the Housing Counseling Network, and started the Racial Economic Equity Department. Currently, he oversees racial economic equity, organizing, research, policy, and government affairs. Dedrick comes from Prosperity Now, where he was a senior fellow and founder of the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative. Before Prosperity Now, Dedrick worked for the NAACP, where he was the senior director of the economics department and executive director of the Financial Freedom Center. Dedrick has also worked for the Reverend Al Sharpton's National Action Network and the Institute for Policy Studies. Dedrick also serves as the chair of the board for Beyond Savvy, an organization focused on financial empowerment for the justice impacted. And he also sits on a variety of advisory boards, including Advancing Black Strategies Initiative, National League of Cities Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, Financial Health Networks Pulse, and Better Markets. And I'm really pleased and privileged to introduce you all here tonight to Dedrick. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And one organization that that wasn't in my bio, but actually started my career in studying racial wealth divide is United for a Fair Economy, that is based in Boston. So about 20 years ago, I started my work, the first time professionally focused on the racial wealth divide, and that was there in Boston, and glad to be virtually with you all this evening.
Yeah, we're pleased to have you too. I might have preferred it in person, but given the weather, it's probably just as well here in Boston that it's a virtual event. So all's well that ends well. So, you know, the agenda for the evening is for you to walk us through some of the background on economic inequality. And then we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about Madison Park's work and then open it up to questions and answers from the wonderful folks who are joining us this evening. So please do take it away.
Great. Well, let me dive in. And again, you know, I've done different types of work around racial equity. I worked in multicultural centers. I worked in maximum security prison for women for a while and did some volunteering there, worked for Reverend Sharpton, and then was, well, I'm glad yes, I do find UFE has great economic education tools and really ahead of the curve in providing that type of economic education kind of for the masses. And it was at United for a Fair Economy where I first started focusing in on this racial wealth gap, or as I call it, the racial wealth divide. And, you know, reason for this was because I'd seen it being so central to the racial inequality issues, particularly for African Americans throughout all the different type of work I've done. And so a saying I commonly put forward is the foundation of racial inequality is racialized economic inequality, and the foundation of economic inequality is wealth inequality. And, you know, like to note this because I think so oftentimes when we have conversations around race and racial equity, we kind of confuse that or conflate that with race relations, with personal prejudices. And I think we do so at the expense of understanding the economics of it. I don't think it was just, bad personal relations or prejudices that led to negative relations between indigenous peoples in the United States and European colonizers. You're going to have bad relations with people who are trying to take your land. And in the case of primarily West Africans, you're going to have bad personal relations with those who are trying to take you to work the land. And I think, again, understanding that, it wasn't just personal prejudice, it was economic drive that created a lot of the stereotypes necessary to justify taking of land or taking of people. And I think the importance of that is without that, the economics underlies that. Until we change the economics, we won't get past this racial inequality. I think there has been a lot of change around personal prejudice, but yet we still see this, deep issues of racial inequality today. And, I put forward again, it's because we haven't changed the economics. So let's go to the next slide. So I like to put forward, and this is very kind of UFE type material, and actually the slide on the left, it's a little dated, but I still appreciate it. It's from United for a Fair Economy. And want to highlight how narratives shape our reality. And like to start off with first, there is a myth that I think is popularly put forward that our socioeconomic system works, and that if something is not going right, if communities aren't doing well, then individuals are doing something wrong. Individuals are doing something wrong on their finances, they're doing something wrong on their job, or they're making bad personal decisions, because that's the only way things could go wrong in such a well-oiled socioeconomic order. But that's the myth. But I think the truth is our economy is designed to reward the wealthy and leave others behind. And the racial aspect of this is our economy was designed to disproportionately benefit white people and oftentimes leave different communities of color behind. And examples of this is an upside down tax system, residential economic segregation, lack of investment in disenfranchised communities. And I use this UFE slide to highlight again, structurally, systematically, how things have changed, at least in terms of overall growth of US family incomes. Between 1947 and 1979, we saw growth throughout every segment, looking at each quintile. Each flower represents 20%, the lowest 20%, the next 20%, the mid 20%, up to the highest 20%. And we see between 1947 and 1979, there was growth everywhere. We just saw that the lowest 20% had the greatest growth of 118%, but even the highest, actually, I think those are 25%, the highest quarter had 114%. So everyone was growing, but it was a little bit more progressive. Between 1979 and 2014, we see that the bottom actually saw a decrease in their growth of family income, while only the top saw a 54% increase. And if we go to the top 1%, that's that big tree of 185% growth. So we've seen that, I think this is a key issue in terms of, I'm focusing a lot on, I talk about the racial wealth divide, this presentation and the Black History Month, and focus pretty particularly on the African-American community, but can take questions about how other communities of color also fit in this picture and these images. But I think a great challenge for African-Americans as they gained, and actually as all communities of color gained progress in taking out outright racist laws and racist quotas and immigration and these types of things through the 60s, the country soon turned to a very regressive economy, so that there was not as much opportunity as you would hope by taking away outright racially unequal laws. So let's go to the next slide. And so again, I think the truth of our reality is that we still have deep racial wealth inequality. And this has information of white wealth from about 1983, where the Consumer Survey Finances has kind of good wealth data, to 2019. It should be updated soon for 2022. They put out their information about every 3 years. And we see with this that, Black wealth is only at about 9,000 median wealth, not including depreciating assets. Hispanic wealth is 14,000, while white wealth is 160,000. So we see that there's massive disparities in terms of wealth. And again, I think wealth is much stronger an economic indicator of how you're doing socioeconomically than even income. There is income divide. African Americans make about 70 cents on every dollar that white Americans make. But in terms of wealth, it's it's a little bit lower than 10 cents on every dollar. So we see that the wealth divide is much broader, and we see that it really hasn't been on a path of decreasing. And I think that is something too that I like to highlight around. I think there's a narrative out there that maybe we're not where we want to be in terms of racial inequality, but over the last 40, 50 years, we've seen a lot of progress, but we haven't seen much progress in bridging racial wealth inequality. And again, I think this highlights to me a crisis that doesn't get addressed. And then on the left side, we see some different particular stats. Black liquid asset poverty, almost 60%, Hispanic liquid asset poverty, a little over 60%, white asset poverty around 30%, Asian American liquid asset poverty around 30%. So we see great differences there. Let's go to the next slide. This slide I like to highlight because I like to note that wealth inequality cuts across educational background. It is true, if you look at these slides, you can see blue representing African-American population, red representing Hispanic, and kind of an orange representing white, that as you go up the educational from less than high school to post-grad, everyone has more wealth with more educational attainment. But it's also you can see that the wealth divide doesn't lessen, particularly in total dollars, the higher you go up. One thing I like to also note is that we see that high school, whites with a high school diploma have around $115,000 of wealth, median household wealth, and which is more than 2 times that of African Americans with a bachelor's degree. So even whites with a much lower educational attainment rate have much greater wealth. And part of this, and part of the reason why wealth is so important, is that wealth has multi-generational effects. That having a lack of wealth from one generation actually, creates impairments, particularly when you're in asset poverty, which I just noted about 60% of African Americans are in asset poverty, continues on to future generations, while having substantial wealth actually also can help future generations. And so we're on a path of this ongoing wealth inequality. Let's go to the next slide. And then here, I developed this feedback loop. I call it the negative feedback loop of Black asset poverty, to highlight how this wealth inequality continues generation after generation. So we start off with lack of household assets. Again, 57% of Blacks from liquid asset poverty. So you start off with a lack of household assets. And then, I like to note that in some countries, they have, strong public assets, public education, supports for affordable housing, these types of things. And in many countries that have much less wealth inequality than the US, they put their public assets investing in those with the least of household assets, of private household assets. But in the United States, we oftentimes have our strongest public assets serving the wealthiest communities, the wealthiest households. So, and vice versa, and on the other side of that, we have our weakest, our inferior public assets going to those who are most in need and have the least private household assets. So you start off with a lack of household assets, and then you're given inferior public assets, which really doubles down on your asset deprivation and overall wealth inequality. And then with that, kind of going in a circle here, we get inferior service from the market. There's a common expression that it's very expensive to be poor, and that oftentimes you can go to a local bodega or something that serves as a grocery store and pay more for inferior goods than you would if you lived in a higher income neighborhood that might have a bigger, I mean, ways better grocery store with cheaper goods. So you have a lack of household assets, inferior public assets, and oftentimes you're paying more for inferior goods. And then, with that, segregated from socioeconomic opportunity, you're oftentimes not in places where it oftentimes can be easy to connect to employment, to connect to services. And then finally, I'll go to this greater financial responsibilities. Even those who are managing to do quite well have managed to break through many different obstacles around wealth inequality. They and even maybe are making great income, they find that they have family responsibilities, personal responsibilities. And so maybe instead of getting money to help you with your down payment of a house, you're actually helping your aunt pay her rent. So these types of issues, and that's not a bad way to spend your money, but it does limit your money to invest because you're actually using your money to help family and friends take care of basic services. So all of these things just help maintain and strengthen wealth inequality at all kind of income levels, education levels. All right, let's go to the next slide. 60% Black home ownership, a radical goal for Black wealth development. It is true that for most Americans, the value of your home is the major component of your wealth, of your private wealth. But what we've seen is that, and this goes back to about 1940 to 2019, and it goes over the different racial groups, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, but again, I focus on Black, white inequality right now. We see there's been a pretty consistent home ownership inequality. And I think what's fascinating, I was looking at some data we see in 2019, and it's about that now. 47.4% of Blacks are homeowners. And I was looking, and it's about 70, I guess in 2019, 72% of whites are homeowners. So you still have this massive disparity. And I was looking at some older data, and I believe white homeownership was right around 47% in 1905. Right, so Blacks are kind of just getting to where whites were in 1905 in terms of home ownership. And so our organization has put together this idea of, can we get to 60% Black home ownership, and what a radical goal that would be for Black wealth development, and what a radical change it would take in mortgage lending, in different types of in development of affordable housing to get to that goal. All right, let's go to the next slide. And around the issues of home ownership, which I know a lot of us deal with, I think it's also important that if we are going to target and try to increase Black, maybe Black and Latino home ownership rates, we have to understand, how African Americans are faring as it relates to home ownership. And I think one of the important things here is oftentimes I hear people pushing, well, you have to get younger people to buy homes earlier. And I understand that, but there's also a reality that a lot of what this current young generation is doing is they are forming kind of long-term households at later stages in life. They're not settling down in the town they're going to live in for the next 30 years when they're 25. It might be much more when they're 35 or 40. And so with that, I think, you see that about 59% of African Americans younger than 35 switch to renting after first owning. And it's 42% for white Americans. And I think, again, that gets to this idea that people aren't really settled in. So they buy a home and then they move to another city for a new job. And then they're renting at this new space. And oftentimes, if you don't own a home for around 7 years, you're probably not getting positive returns on it unless you happen to be buying a home in a booming cycle. But, so I think it's really important that we look at the ages, I say 35 to 35 plus, as prime spaces for particularly low wealth communities to really focus in on bringing them into home ownership. So it's long-term home ownership. It's not that it falls right back into renting. And then also too, we'll note that even if we bridge, we just had a goal of 60% Black home ownership. That's not even getting to white home ownership levels of 74%. But even if somehow we did get to that space, there is still an inequality in the value of homes, which makes sense when you have African Americans make much less income, much less wealth. They buy cheaper homes, but you also have the discrimination of the market, where a home in a Black community is valued less by the market, the predominantly white buyers, than a home in a predominantly white community. So even if it's the exact same home, it'll have less value on the market. So I say all that to say, even though I believe home ownership is very important and can make radical increases in Black, Latino, Native American wealth building, it still would not create equality in home ownership, in wealth, if there was equal home ownership. Let's go to the next slide. I just want to jump to the kind of the bullet points here of, and I think one positive thing that we've seen over the last few years is there's much more discussion now than I've really ever seen around racial wealth gap, racial wealth divide. So I think that's very important. And there's even more movements around addressing this issue head on. In the past, oftentimes we were talking about, okay, we need to increase home ownership. Let's increase home ownership for everyone. But I think there's a recognition, no, we don't just need to increase home ownership for everyone. We need to focus in particular communities. And actually, I'll jump to the last bullet point in this slide, talking about special purpose credit programs. And special purpose credit programs, I was in some meetings with some different financial institutions earlier today, and it's interesting to me how many major banks are starting to pilot, oftentimes not publicly, special purpose credit programs, which allows them to develop particular mortgage packages that can be helpful for home ownership, designed just for African Americans or just for majority minority neighborhoods. And I do think this type of focus is what focused programs is what's going to be needed to address this issue that we see we haven't been on a path of solving, because I think we've been too reticent to actually deal with these issues of racial economic inequality and develop programs particularly to address that. Let's go to the next slide. This comes from a report that we did around COVID, and we called it White Supremacy is the Pre-Existing Condition, 8 Solutions to Ensure Economic Recovery that Reduces the Racial Wealth Divide. And just wanted to highlight some of the broad things that I think are needed to address racial wealth inequality. Because again, no one thing will bridge racial wealth inequality, and no one thing quickly is going to do it. It's going to require a host of policies, right? And so we have things like improved racial data collection as part of emergency investment. It's really important. We just went through this COVID cycle where trillions of dollars we just pulled out of nowhere to give to Americans, to give to businesses, to help them get through this crisis. But we need much better analysis around, well, how do you make sure that those dollars are not continuing racial economic inequality? But if we're going to spend trillions of dollars, can we spend it in a way that actually helps bridge it? So as we start coming out of a crisis, we've actually made some progress. And again, to me, racial economic inequality, the racial wealth divide, is a crisis. And we need to understand it probably will take us some trillions of dollars to bridge this. It's actually estimated that African Americans have about $10 trillion less than needed in order for them to have their proportional share of American wealth. They have around $3 trillion total in wealth, and we need about 13 to have their equitable share of the around $100 trillion of wealth of the United States of America. In the 8 solutions, we also have things about creating a federal jobs guarantee. Most of the last 50 years, African Americans have had twice the unemployment rate of whites. Over the last few years, we've actually seen some bridging of that. So maybe it's 1.75 times, but we definitely need, and African Americans at a record low level of unemployment, around 6%, but 6% unemployment would be almost considered recessionary if that was white unemployment level. So, we still a lot of work that needs to be done around employment, making sure there is mass employment. Number 6 was expand inclusive housing and housing and ownership, And you can see that I have on the side here, invest in affordable housing. And there was a proposal called the American Housing Economic Mobility Act that was being discussed. I guess that was in 2020, but it's my understanding they're about to resubmit this bill that would put in, almost $500 billion of investment in the housing trust fund, actually have some targeting of historically redlined neighborhoods for some of these programs. So, we need this type of massive investment as well. And we also have things like delinking healthcare from employment. Health costs are one of the number one drivers of bankruptcy. So, we need a kind of a full-on attack to address these issues of deep racial economic inequality. I think I'm running about out of time, so let me go to the next slide. I've done different work. I've done different racial wealth divide profiles when I was at an organization called Prosperity Now, and they continue to do great racial wealth divide profiles in different cities. So we did I was part of the ones that we did in Dallas, Wilmington, New Orleans, Baltimore, Miami, Chicago. And, some of the learnings I picked up we would always work with 5 or 6 local people of color nonprofits to get some learnings about how they're addressing racial economic inequality. And one of the 3 things that pulled away from that was that racial economic inequality is large throughout cities, regardless of size or strength of the economy. It was fascinating to me that an economy that might be considered a post-industrial city that's, has high unemployment overall and what have you, even in those cities, you would see strong racial inequality, particularly between Black, white. But you could also go to booming cities, a city like Austin that has very, strong economic growth, but still see substantial racial economic inequality. So this idea that you're going to solve racial inequality by growth hasn't proven to be the case. I do think growth is a helpful phenomenon in order to lift people up. But again, you have to have a growth that's focused on disproportionately helping those most left behind in order to actually bridge this inequality. One thing I also noted is that there's very little in shared best practices to address racial economic inequality. At best, someone might develop a program that's really effective and they're so focused on just getting their program out to their constituents. And no one program does it. So you might do a really important after-school program for youth, but those youth don't just need an after-school program. Their parents probably also need a job placement program, right? Someone else might need some type of healthcare assistance, these types of things. So how we can bring together different nonprofits and services together to have holistic services that really can help move people forward. And then also too, a comprehensive long-term approach is necessary for community economic development that addresses racial economic inequality. As someone that's been in the kind of nonprofit industrial complex, it's driven so much by 2-year grants, 1-year grants, 3-year grants, and your posts at the end show this massive progress when actually to really move people forward substantively, socioeconomically, usually requires 10, 20 years. So how do we develop programs that our funding cycles might be 1 to 3 years, but actually to really move things forward, we need 5, 10, 15 years. So those are all things that I like to bring up and figure out how we can better address those issues. And let's go to, I think, my last slide or my near last slide. Oh, this is my last slide. This is stay connected. I could talk for hours about different aspects of racial economic inequality. I believe we shared links to these racial wealth snapshots. So if you want to do a quick overview of let's say Latinos or Asian Americans in the racial wealth divide, or women of color in the racial wealth divide, or immigrants, you can go to these snapshots that in 5-6 pages tries to highlight the realities of racial economic inequality in those communities. And also we just did a paper on this place called in Columbia, Maryland, a place I grew up, that uniquely was designed to address racial or to kind of be integrated, Black, white, integrated by income, and wanted to look at over 55 years, what has happened in the community. Most of the time we're studying communities that historically have been segregated and trying to deal with the problem that has been there since the beginning. Now we're looking at a place like Columbia, Maryland, where it's actually designed to be integrated, but we see that creeping segregation is occurring. And what can we learn from that? So that's a paper. And then you see my Facebook, Racial Wealth Divide, Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide, WordPress, while my writings are. But hopefully, looking forward to this dialogue we're about to have, and hopefully can continue the dialogue in the future through other means. So I will stop my presentation there.
So Dedrick, thanks so much for your important work and that presentation. One of the takeaways for me that I carry closely is that, this economic inequality affects city regardless of size. And as much as I love Boston and Roxbury, it makes me realize we're not so precious and that we're going to have to think really broadly and strategically. And as a community-based organization, we have like our nose down, right down to the grindstone. But this reminds me that we have to lift our heads up and look more broadly. I was hoping to just take a moment and share some of the initiatives that Madison Park is doing and see how you think they kind of fit into this idea of kind of broader strategies. We have 3 key strategies that are part of a program called Madison Park Next Door. One of the key strategies is bringing homeownership education, financial counseling, and most importantly, significant down payment assistance to our current residents. So Madison Park is proud to offer up to $100,000 in down payment assistance to help our current rental residents purchase homes in the city of Boston. We even expanded that. We were like, fine, if not the city of Boston, we'll give you 50, right? Because housing choice. We've been really proud to be able to serve 11 households through that program to date, which was initiated in 2018. And then, that does a lot of things to address some of the disparities that you talked about and move people towards, the opportunity to own a home. It's also stability. We also know that homeowners are more civically engaged. It just has so many benefits, and we free up a precious affordable rental unit, where there's so much need for that as well.
Can I make one comment on that piece? Yeah, I think one thing that's so important is, I'm not against financial education in any way. I'm supportive of it. I just think financial education or financial capability, some people use, that doesn't connect you to resources, is very limited, right? And so that's what I like very much about your program, because it's one thing just to say, okay, this is what you should do with savings, or this is how you should buy a house. But if you don't have savings, if you don't have assets to help you take advantage of your financial education, it gets very little use. So I think what you've put forward of connecting financial education with assets, with opportunities and programs is also the best way to learn, because it's kind of hard just to study something about finance theoretically, but it's really not connected to your life. So I just want to compliment you on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I share your frustration. Like, what's the point of lecturing somebody on how to budget if they don't make a living wage? Like, what's the point of that, right? There's got to be more. And, I'm very proud to be part of an organization that's tried to make deeper connections. The second strategy is developing additional home ownership opportunities in our community. Madison Park has been very successful. We've developed over 1,500 rental units, as part of our mission, and we're really proud of that. And that includes the first community-led and owned affordable housing development in the country. That includes, community-led redevelopment of public housing and improvements to public housing. So we're really proud of that. But, 1,500 units of rental housing, 129 homeownership units in the same duration of time, right? Yeah. We have to do better. So we're really proud to be investing in a pipeline of development that represents an additional 100 homeownership opportunities over the next 3 to 5 years. So in the next 3 to 5 years, we'll be able to increase the homeownership opportunities that we're offering by 80%. It helps move that needle. I like to say poco a poco, but little by little we move the needle. And so we are making significant organizational investments to ensure that our development projects deliberately include homeownership opportunities.
And just on that, I will note, I talk a lot about homeownership, you know, and I guess, you know, in general, I wasn't able to talk about everything, but obviously affordable housing in terms of rental is also essential. You know, we need both, right? We need massive affordable rentals. So you're not going completely broke in your rental. So at some point you can save a little bit of money and eventually move toward home ownership. So, you know, it's not one or the other. It's definitely both. And the sad thing is we're in radically need of both. Like I wish we had plenty of affordable rentals. We could just focus on affordable homes, but we're in radical need. And when I say we, I mean across the country. I was hearing mortgage financials talking today that they really feel that we're going even to a greater crisis of affordable, they were talking about affordable single family homes, but we all know that also affordable rentals is a great concern. And actually the president of NCRC, Jesse Van Tol, likes to highlight one of the biggest benefits of home ownership is not that you get radical returns on your home, but you know, you have a 30-year mortgage, you're controlling your housing costs for 30 years, right? And that every renter would love to be able to control their rental costs for 30 years. So it's not like, oh, and next year I can't afford where I'm going to be, or in 2 or 3 years and have to move around. So, you know, putting that type of, you know, how can we set up long-term affordable rentals as we have not really affordable, but we still have a long-term steady cost of home ownership. How can we do that for rentals as well?
Yeah, well, agreed. And that's a perfect transition to the third key element of our Next Door program, which is a program called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. And it's actually targeted to current rental residents that receive rental assistance. And as many people know, you know, your rent when you receive rental assistance is based on your income. So if your income goes up, your rent goes up. Fair enough, but also kind of odd. In a way, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program is a federal program which allows us, when a household's income goes up, to escrow the incremental increase in their rent into a savings account that inures to the benefit of that household. And it comes along with something, I like it because it's not financial coaching, it's support and household goal setting. And what I love about family self-sufficiency is you can use it for a down payment for a home if that's your family's goal. You can use it to start a business or buy a car or go to college or take a vacation if that's what you decide to do. And it really is kind of focusing on how we can, in the situation of rental housing, contribute to assets that then, create paths, right? And, to wealth. And I like to say, assets are when you have something of value or worth. Wealth is when your assets exceed your liabilities. And again, you said you have something that you can pass on, right? Yeah. And so how do we address some of the issues that we have in the affordable rental housing system to help get people on that path? And it's been really gratifying. We've seen in the program, we see increases in earned income. People who participate in the program are earning more. We're seeing savings, of course, with the escrow, but we're also seeing improvements to credit, reduction to derogatory credit, because we know that, you have to have money to use money, and credit scores we know are so important for how much it costs people to access, to leverage, their income and their debt. And so we've been really proud to help pilot the introduction of that program into privately owned affordable housing here in Boston in partnership with 4 other community-based nonprofits. And it kind of feels like that companion piece to the home ownership. Sometimes I feel conflicted because it's like, yeah, we'll give you $100,000 if you want to buy a home, but if you don't want to buy a house, you're crap out of luck. Like, that can't be the only answer, and I'm not sure that we have those answers given the mission and experience of our organization. And I'm very, very curious and interested and beyond supporting people in homeownership and maybe, helping to create savings and other benefits, by modifying some housing policy. How do we think about, other opportunities for folks, because not everybody is going to be a homeowner, but we still need paths to asset building, right?
Yeah.
And wealth building for people who don't own their homes. And so I'm really interested and curious, to hear you talk a little bit about, again, what you think about our programs, but about those other strategies and where you see opportunities.
When you reminded me, I didn't talk about one important wealth building strategy, but first on this last of the three you mentioned that you are working on, I think the great thing about that program, or a great thing about that program, is one of the other massive benefits of home ownership is, again, it's been averaged that really maybe you get 1% return a year on your house. It's not like you're getting 10, 20%, but that, your mortgage payment really becomes a forced savings mechanism, right? Like you're paying your mortgage, and then by the time you see paid off in 30 years, now you have a piece of property that's valued at $300,000. And so you have that asset. With rent, you're not getting anything after you pay your rent every month. Even if you pay for 30 years, you don't have any asset at the end. So this idea that you are paying rent and that some of that goes into some type of savings or investment account or something like that, that then can be used for future purchases, investments, is really important. I think kind of helps highlight that shift of, or what was negatively done was this idea that all they're thinking about is income. So, okay, we want to make sure you have enough to live in the apartment, and that's it. But the idea is that, no, we want you to have enough to live in the apartment and economically grow. So just because your income goes up $100 doesn't mean that now your rent goes up the $100, because you're not going forward. We're trying to move people forward economically, and I think that's what a good use of wealth and asset development framing in our programs would do. One of the things I left out is that you're right. Many people are going to be are going to be renters. There's always going to be a large percentage of the population that are renters, and that should be fine. Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton used to do a lot of work together. They're economists that focus a lot on different issues of racial economic inequality, about creating a means for all Americans, but ones that would help those who are most in asset poverty disproportionately develop ways of having wealth. And they had this idea of baby bonds, which are being presented. And I think one of the important things is, a concern I have is sometimes people put forth baby bonds or slightly different, but children's savings account. They do it at such a micro level, $50, $500. That's really not going to do anything over time. But the idea of every American's getting $10,000, and then there's a match, particularly for lower income or lower wealth households, until the child is 18 or 21, and then that can be used. Jesse Jackson used to say it's very difficult to be in a capitalist society with no capital. And so the idea is that we need to have a universal program that allows everyone to have some starting capital so they actually can participate in our economy. So I do think, our local nonprofits can do great work, but we also need large kind of federal programs, maybe some state supported programs that can, make our programs even more successful.
Agreed. Well, now we have the opportunity to open it up to the folks who have joined us. I think we have at least 3 questions that have been submitted, which I guess maybe I'll introduce, and then I'd be happy to open it up for folks who are here to ask questions live. We got a really good question, which is, how can a family or single person make investments when they're living from paycheck to paycheck?
Yeah, obviously that would be a deep challenge. I do think, and there's different stages, right, of kind of wealth and asset development. And what I do oftentimes recommend is that when you're really starting to live, or when you are living paycheck to paycheck, the first thing you want to do is develop some type of basic savings account, right? And when I say savings account, I don't mean it has to be, in the bank, a savings account, because I found when I tried to have a savings account, if I took money out of it and I took it too often, then they penalized me for it. So my savings account was a second checking account, so I wouldn't, be penalized for it. but making sure you're saving something, even if it's $5 a paycheck, right? $10 a paycheck, just so that builds up over time, I think is essential, because that's the first step. Because you do need, because you can, if you want, well, you can, if you want, try to set aside money for some investments in some type of index fund or some type of stock investment. But if things happen, right? Tires blow, expenses occur, you really do need that $500,000 set aside for a crisis. And that can be a lot of work for someone to develop. So that might be your first plan for over the year, and then with that, does the job you have provide, some type of 401k program, or so, and particularly if it does matching, then, you always want to do that type. If they do 3% matching, then do that 3%. Don't put any more in, because you probably need that money to build up your savings from 500 to 1,000 or to 2,000, or you might need that money to actually put your kid in a little bit better aftercare program, whatever it is. But you definitely, where there's free money, you want to make sure you're taking advantage of that as much as possible. And that's also why it's important to be connected to community organizations, nonprofits that might connect you to programs that you don't even know, that there might be some type of matching funds for savings that you didn't even know is available, that could really help you. Because again, when you have little to no wealth, little things can make a big difference. And so try to have that kind of positive attitude about it.
Yeah, I agree. I want to just echo the 401k match kind of opportunity, and that when employers, provide that, like, there's a part of me that, I'm heartbroken that we privatized retirement savings rather than investing more robustly in Social Security. It is what it is, right? It is a capitalist society, but, some of the other benefits that we've seen is that people are allowed to withdraw or borrow against those resources at like rates that you couldn't get anywhere else. So for example, for Madison Park Development Corporation, we do a 401k match, and our employees can borrow against that at 4%. What? And so that's a really great benefit, for folks. So I understand when you're living paycheck to paycheck, your ability to make what we might broadly consider investments is challenging, but this idea of leveraging a match, makes a lot of sense to me.
And I just want to highlight one thing about the paycheck to paycheck, because I think some people put in their minds that paycheck to paycheck is for the very poor, but paycheck to paycheck goes way up the income scale, particularly for those who are in communities with low wealth, right? So, there's households that are making six figures, or more, that are still paycheck to paycheck, because it takes a good amount to actually move into a home in a quote unquote good neighborhood with no down payment, help from friends or family. So, I just want everyone to be cognizant of, that fact, and that many of us, you think, are making it. And many of us in the nonprofit sector who are helping others need this advice as well, need these services as well.
We all do. Thank you. Thank you for saying that, because that is something that we experience. You can get a master's degree and earn six figures. And if you don't have savings or assets or some net worth, you're just a heartbeat away, right? And so it is important to, remember that it's not just about raising income levels or educational levels. Those are important things. Without companion ways to build assets and safety nets for households, it's really challenging. So you might have touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. One of the questions is that under the previous administration, he who shall not be named, there was not a lot of federal relief available for families. But now with the current administration, the question is there a chance that the federal government is going to do more to address the housing crisis?
Yes, I would like to be more positive about this answer, but I haven't seen a lot of strong indicators, though I think Biden in his platform did have some interesting housing initiatives. It doesn't seem like these are things being put forth strongly since he's been in office and currently, particularly with this idea in his administration that the most important thing to attack right now is inflation versus the most important thing I think to attack is economic instability for most Americans, which actually they like to conflate that with inflation, but actually the data I've seen has shown that actually the investments in Americans has been more beneficial than even the challenges around inflation. But I will again put forward, I am interested that your senator, Elizabeth Warren, I believe is reintroducing the Economic Housing and Mobility Act, which I do think was one of the most progressive pieces of legislation dealing with home ownership. And I do think support for that, there's definitely more room with a President Biden who has proclaimed support for such things, but hasn't seemed to been able to lead in that. But I'm excited to see Senator Warren and hopefully others rally behind that and see if we can really put that on the agenda for 2023, 2024. Because even though it becomes a partisan issue, unaffordable housing is bipartisan in the sense that many Republican districts are also suffering and are dealing with this issue. I think one of the challenges is a conservative approach to this is saying, well, if we just have deregulation, we will have affordable housing. But I think 40 years of deregulation shows that we don't create affordable housing just through deregulation, that there actually has to be government investment.
Agreed. So we do have a question that was submitted through the Q&A. I want to take this opportunity to remind people to please submit your questions, and also we'll open it up. But we got a really excellent question from a wonderful housing advocate. I won't say her name necessarily unless she wants to unmute. Maria Christina, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or would you prefer that I share it? Well, I'm going to go ahead and share it then. Maria's question is, how does the approach of increasing homeownership for underrepresented racial groups within the current economic structure compare to an alternative approach of creating public policy that limits the wealth building through real estate and begins to treat housing as a human right rather than a speculative investment? And this could include restricting the ability of for-profit corporations to own housing or the amount of profit that they're trying to make, enacting, higher transfer, estate, or vacancy taxes that take some of that profit and, redirect it, creating universal deed restrictions on housing. Kind of what are your thoughts? I do sometimes get like we're fighting to enter into the homeownership space, and then we're just further commodifying land because this is capitalist. And then sometimes I get confused about that. And so I do agree that, are there ways that we could think about alternative approaches to creating access to housing and building wealth that don't, leverage the roof over your head as a profit center?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would put forward that I don't see these two things inherently being one or the other. That, I do think that you can advance individual home ownership while at the same time having a recognition that we need to limit wealth building, particularly particularly for the highest income, the most wealthy, around real estate holdings. So Chuck Collins, who used to be United for a Fair Economy, I've worked with throughout the years, based out of Boston, has done a series of reports around how luxury housing and the costs that luxury housing is putting in communities all across the country, and that there should be greater taxation on home ownership by people who don't live there the majority of the time, but but they buy these homes, maybe they're there for a month or 2 months, and it's actually increasing the cost of home ownership in the entire area, and it's in many ways taxing local communities and making it not affordable for people who want to live there. So I definitely think through our taxing system, we can do better in taxing the wealthy as they, profiting. And also, too, I'll note, we don't need to subsidize high income homeownership, right? We don't need to subsidize that if you're buying a home. And now, again, I understand there's places that are very expensive, but I would much more prefer to do little to no subsidizing of a $500,000 home and focus on that subsidizing on $300,000, $250,000 homes. So, and I think that really would increase home ownership in general. And then there's this idea too that, we will need, even if we're increasing home ownership, we're going to need, affordable rentals. I think we could also do much more in providing opportunities for cooperatives and types of ownership that might not allow you to profit so much on the selling of the property later, but the benefit is you have affordable housing over time and you get to utilize that space. So I think it should be all of those things, not thinking you just have to choose one.
I love that you say all of those things. My approach to housing policy is we have to do all the things. We need land trusts and cooperatives, and we need to produce more housing in general, right? Because part of what's happening in Massachusetts is we just haven't built enough to match our growth. And we should be doing home ownership and rental. And let's not forget about age-restricted housing and housing for people with different abilities, housing with services. I feel like this concept is that it's not a zero-sum game, right? Yeah. And that investments in multiple housing policies might actually help us,
And with that too, I don't think the private market, it's failed the last 40, 50 years to provide the number of housing and affordable housing. And so I do think we're gonna have much more government funded creation of housing because the market itself won't do it. And in those spaces, I think it is most appropriate to even have more concerns about making sure high income, wealthy people aren't benefiting off of that. But it's going to be a mixed economy. I think, and we do live in a mixed economy, and we need to recognize that and have a mixed economy approach to the housing crisis we're in.
Agreed. So we have another question. It's probably pretty particular. I don't know. It's a particular market dynamic, which is, condos are often the most accessible initial home ownership opportunity in strong markets like Greater Boston. And are there assistance programs for people looking to make the move from a condominium to a home? And kind of how does that strategy fit in here?
Yeah, and from a condo, meaning a condominium that you actually own, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I think I'm not an expert on this at all. So, and you probably are better expert. You probably know this better than myself, but I would think a challenge in that dynamic is that oftentimes you wouldn't be considered a new homeowner when you're moving from a condo to a single family home or what have you. And so you don't get the benefits of new home ownership programs. And I think that is one thing that could be looked at is how could you change some of the regulations around new homeowner programs that allow for those who own smaller spaces like a condo that costs less and still give them benefit to then move into a larger home, maybe like a condo with this idea that maybe that's for 1 or 2 people, but you want to do new homeowners that allow for households of 3 or 4. So I think, that's one thing off my mind. I don't know if you know specifically of programs that assist.
Yeah, I am not aware of any programs like that. And, I've spent most of my career working in Boston, and we're kind of running out of land. And there are concepts of smart growth and we have to build up because we can't build out, if we were just to take every lot and put one home on it, we would never be able to meet the needs of our community. There were 100,000 people living in Roxbury in 1950 before disinvestment and urban renewal. We're only at 55,000 today, and so there is a tension between, I think, the land that we have and the building typology. And, condominiums lend themselves to the kind of multifamily, kind of denser, smarter development, especially around transit and services. And so,
no, and I think you bring up a really important point about Boston, but also true in Baltimore, also true Detroit, also true in Chicago. That's a very good economy that 40 years ago, there were a lot more people living in those spaces, but yet still you can find it be pretty unaffordable in those places. Like, how is that possible when we fit so many more people in the past, right? And again, I think we will need that type of investment to actually, there is the space, particularly in some places like Detroit or Baltimore. And Baltimore is interesting because it's in a very high income state with a very, outside of Baltimore, a very strong housing market. So like, we have all these abandoned homes. Why can't we utilize them and make them affordable homes and be one of the most affordable homes in Maryland? So I think, and I think part of the problem again is we leave it to individual private developers instead of a much larger scale planning that can help deal with the large scale problems we're trying to grapple with.
Agreed. So we have another question, and again, it revisits this idea of other innovative strategies to reduce the racial wealth gap. You know, how do we work across the country in tandem to develop comprehensive, multi-pronged approaches, right? And it turns into a comment, which is unfortunately the underbelly of systemic oppression has created an environment that does not allow for meaningful and effective strategic approaches to reduce this gap. You know, the interventions, like you said, are so localized and, you know, they don't scale, you know, and make, you know, major impacts. And so maybe you could speak a little bit more again to how do we think strategically and broadly about collaborating on comprehensive strategies to this issue and not just focus on homeownership as like the end all be all solution, because we know that's not it.
Well, you know, again, I'll kind of fall back to this idea of all of the above, in that the local specific programs that people are working on are very important, are essential, and should be worked on. We need to kind of give ourselves space and actually encourage foundations and government agencies to invest in nonprofits to not just deliver a program, but to actually think and to actually have time to partner. Again, because your housing program probably should connect to an after-school program, to a health program, to a job training program, to a job placement program. So locally, oftentimes, there's not even enough interconnection and working together and sharing of best practices. And how does this local nonprofit better support its staff that then can have effects? Because one great thing about local organizations is oftentimes they employ people in the local area. And so that can be in itself economic empowerment mechanism. And then, you know, doing that local work while at the same time being connected to regional and national organizations, right? NCRC tries to be a piece of that, right? We have 750 local membership groups that focus, many of them focus on the local area, some do state regional work, and then the national NCRC tries to bring them together to advocate national policy. We're having a national conference in a few weeks, and before that, we have a national advocacy week where we're organizing over 60 congressional visits by our local members, right? And you need someone at the national space that can help, bring the local to do that national work. And then you need people doing the local work that the national can learn from. And the national group should be doing much better in highlighting, picking up best practices and sharing it, so that every local group has to start from scratch to figure out how to do this type of work. There can't be this kind of competitiveness about, I have my program and I know how to run it well, but what we really need is, I have a program, I know how to run it well, and I need to share it so it can be done all throughout the country.
Yeah. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention NeighborWorks America. Madison Park is a network member. That is a federally funded program, which is targeted specifically to fund organizations that do housing, affordable housing, and other services in the community. And they do a really good job of providing training and best practices and helping us to advocate at the national level. You know, they also do this really great kind of like normalizing, like what you do in Boston isn't what you do in Montana, right? And so they kind of help to create like groups that have similar challenges and then connect us. So I think that's another example of where, you know, there are efforts, right, to come together around best practices and also advocate, you know, at the federal level for better investments in this area. So We don't have another question, and I think, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I'm so grateful that you could join us. I feel a lot of gratitude to be in this space, having this level of dialogue with our community. One thing that I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention is there is this wonderful program called the Community Investment Tax Credit, where people who make contributions to our organization get a 50% rebate from the Department of Revenue, whether you have tax liability or not. And that, of course, goes to support some of the wonderful programs that we've talked about and kind of sustains our investments in the community. So I can't help but suggest to people that they visit our website if they're interested in supporting our work at whatever level. Every bit helps to ensure investments in our community. So again, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we'd like to maybe introduce this as a series of forums where maybe we can focus on different issues, but I love this opportunity to get a shared understanding of the origins and the nature of the issue that we're confronting and have a shared understanding so that we can figure out what are the strategies we want to deploy. So I want to see if you have any kind of closing thoughts or words you would share with us.
My only, closing thoughts are thanks everyone for the time, for, coming out this evening virtually to engage in this type of conversation. I look to one day coming up to Boston in person and maybe having in-person dialogue. Definitely check out ncrc.org just to see if there's some different programs that we're doing that might be inspirational to you to strengthen your work. And if you have some great programs, please reach out to me, Asante-Muhammed at ncrc.org. I oversee, policy, research, organizing, and our racial economic equity teams. Always looking for, best practices, promising practices, and want to thank everyone. I'm sure, people come to these types of things are always the people who are doing some of the greatest work in their community. So I want to thank you all for all the work you do, and hopefully I'll be able to learn from you all as well.
Thank you so much, Dedrick. And I just want to echo, that people take time to join in these dialogues is really meaningful. And we're not going to change any of this, but for folks like the ones that have joined us this evening. And so again, I, am in this space with a deep level of gratitude to be having this kind of dialogue and we used to say impacted communities, and I'm like impactful community, remembering that Roxbury is not only the geographic heart of the city of Boston, but it's also the beating heart of the historic African-American community. And how grateful am I for everyone that contributed to this and enters into these dialogues in this really, really important community. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thanks so much.